live. Welcome to Comp and Coffee. My name's Ruth Thomas and I am Chief Product Evangelist here at PayScale. And already 5 seconds into this episode, you will have probably noticed something very different. Russ Wakelin, who's been the longtime host of Comp and Coffee, has moved on to new adventures, and I am going to be taking over as the mainstay host of the show. Of course, I'm going to be joined by many different guests as we progress with Comp and Coffee. If you've got any ideas of who you'd like to hear join me on Comp and Coffee, then do email us at coffee@payscale.com. And even if you'd like to come and join me here and have a chat, drop an email to coffee@payscale.com. Well, there are, I think, I just looked up, 44 days left in 2023. So it's the time of the year when we start to get a bit reflective, and also part of my role in thought leadership is doing predictions for 2024. So we've got about 3 more episodes of Comp and Coffee to run for the rest of this year. Most of those we're going to be focused on looking at potential predictions for 2024. And today's topic is gender pay gaps. And the reason we've chosen gender pay gaps is because on the 22nd of November, it is the UK Equal Pay Day, and we'll explain why that is on the 22nd of November in a moment. I'm delighted to say I'm joined by 2 colleagues today. I'm joined by Vicki Peakman, my longtime collaborator on all things pay equity, and Vicky is Director in Product of Data Products, and also joined by Liz Sheffield, who's Manager in our Content Marketing function and a long-time observer and excellent writer on all things to do with HR. So welcome, Liz, and welcome, Vicky.
Happy to be here.
Thank you. Yeah.
So it is that time of year when we are probably thinking about Thanksgiving, thinking about Christmas lists, and probably also thinking maybe about New Year's resolutions. So Liz, do you set New Year's resolutions? Is that something you're into?
Depends on the year, Ruth. I appreciate you bringing it up early for me because maybe I will this year. Yeah, I just go back and forth based on my ambition. Yeah.
And how you're feeling. What about you, Vicky?
So I don't really agree with them, because I feel like if you want to do something, you should set a goal and do it. I think we generally, if you set one, then you're generally disappointed by February. And so particularly as it's like in the hard months of the year, like, so actually I think it's probably better not to, but
yeah, I kind of agree with you. And what I do instead is set intentions.
Oh, very nice.
So I normally kind of think about things that I would like to be potentially more focused on or less focused on, or things that I'd like to be more intentional about. And then you're kind of less setting yourself up to fail, I think. So,
yeah.
Anyway, back to gender pay gaps. So I mentioned at the top of the show, it is coming up to UK Equal Pay Day. Can you tell us why that's at a different time than US Pay Day, and why is it on the 22nd of November this year, Vicky?
Yeah, so you do it in the UK slightly differently than they do in the US. So in the UK, it's the day on which women basically stop being paid. Men continue to be paid to the end of the year. Women have a shortfall on that amount, and that's the day at which, and there's, it's like the women put their out of office on. They don't, of course, stop working, unfortunately.
That was the
Yeah, they're just not paid for it. That was where the out of office joke came from. And so it's creeping closer to the end of the year. The gender pay equal pay day is declared by the Fawcett Society, which is a leading charity here in the UK for women's rights at home, work and in public life. And they use the mean pay gap from the ONS data, which is the Office of National Statistics in the UK. And this year it is the mean pay gap is 10.7% for full-time workers, and that's the one they use. Last year it was 10.9%, so we're having to go in decimal places. And so last year the Equal Pay Day was on the 20th of November, whereas this year it's on the 22nd. So we're creeping there slowly. I thought I'd have a little look at the data going back some time, and just for context, 13 it was 15.7%, and 2003, so 20 years ago, it was 19.4%. And actually, the first record I could find on the ONS website was 1997, and that was 20.7%. So exactly 10% higher. So it's taken us just a little over 20 years to get down that 10%, 20 years to go.
So that was great. Well, slow progress. Maybe not so great.
Slow progress. Yeah, we're getting there, but it's very slowly.
So Liz, tomatoes, you do it differently in the US. Tell us when the US Equal Pay Day is and how that's calculated.
Yes. So over here on the other side of the pond, Equal Pay Day was March 14th, 2023. And it is interesting. So for the US, that day is the day we celebrate, where we symbolizes, celebrate, maybe not the right choice of words there, but that symbolizes, so December 31st, men are paid through that day. Would have taken until March 14th, 2023 for women to make the same amount that the men made the previous year. So I think it's a really powerful way to illustrate the gap, which is what we're here talking about. For us, it's declared by the National Committee on Pay Equity, which I think is reassuring. We have a national committee about pay equity. And it's also significant for us here at PayScale because that's when we publish our gender pay gap report. So this year, or in 2023, we took data from January that was collected January 2021 through January 2023. And that was over 750,000 people that had submitted information about their salaries, their demographic information, including their race. And then we leveraged that sample to look at what the pay gap was. So along the lines of what Vicky was talking about, we found that indeed there is still a pay gap. And for the controlled pay gap, women are earning 99 cents for every dollar earned by men. But the uncontrolled pay gap is when women are earning 83 cents for every dollar earned by men.
Right.
Again, some progress still to be made.
So just to clarify,
I was going to say,
the 10% is uncontrolled pay gap. So that is
okay.
And this is the mean as well. So it's the average man versus the average woman in the whole of the UK.
Okay.
So let's do a bit of clarification for the audience because it's a question that we always get asked. What is the difference between the controlled and the uncontrolled pay gaps? There's lots of different names for them. Vicky, do you want to help us out there?
Sure. So the uncontrolled is an aggregate. If we just talk about a company for a minute, rather than thinking about it as a country, because it's slightly easier to kind of conceptualize. As a company, if you're looking at the uncontrolled pay gap, it is that average, so mean or median, depending on, or both man versus woman, like what they're paid, and it's the percentage difference between the two. Men minus women divided by man, right? That's the calculation there. So that is in general, and that's often, we often think of that as the opportunity gap. So like, why is it often that the average woman is lower than the average man in the organization? And it's generally due to like the ability to progress within that organization. So it's not just about pay. It is about pay, obviously, it's about the pay, but it isn't just about pay. It's because it's to do with the whole organization. Controlled pay gap is when you actually then control for factors. So it's also called the adjusted pay gap as well, which means that what you're doing is you're looking at factors to make sure that you're making it more closer to equal pay versus the uncontrolled. So what you're doing is you're looking at people who are doing similar roles. Maybe they've got similar experience, so it's whatever factors that you are defining as your kind of compensable factors, we call them, like reasons to be paid differently. And so then you're reducing it down. So if we control for job and experience and maybe location, then you're going to reduce that down to being like close to equal pay. And then that's why that number generally goes closer to 0%.
So when we were talking about the GPG report this year, the control gap was 99 cents on the dollar. So quite small, but not yet closed. And the uncontrolled was 83 cents on the dollar. So that's why you see that kind of difference. Yeah. And that control pay gap sometimes called the equal pay gap as well. So it's like equal pay gap, opportunity gap is sometimes how people.
Exactly. And when we're looking at it in our report, and also the ONS, when they're looking at it, that's at a national level rather than a company level. And often then you can actually get closer. It often looks like it's closer to zero because there's a lot more factors to control for, a lot more sample size and people are being paid similar across companies. Whereas within companies, it's quite rare to get it quite as close to like 99 cents on the dollar, like, or that 1% pay gap. Sometimes they can actually get it. It's more like a sort of 2 or 3%. And that's because there are fewer people, there's more noise around it as well. So not everybody, every company who's listening to this will be like, oh, my control pay gap isn't the same as the country. Like, that's why it's.
Yeah. And I guess, my observation always is, and I think you pointed out some of that trend data there, Vicky, is that whichever gap you look at in kind of more recent years, progress in closing them seems to have stalled for many reasons, despite the fact that we do see employers remaining highly committed to addressing pay equity. It's one of the questions we ask in our compensation best practice report, which is our kind of big annual survey that we do over 5,000 participants. And it's really your kind of encyclopedia of all things and trends that are happening with pay practices. We're actually fielding currently for responses. So we'll include a link to that survey in the resources for this podcast. But you can find that on payscale.com at the moment, or if you follow me on LinkedIn, I think I've been sharing the link for you all as well to encourage you to take part. But when we looked at CVPR earlier this year, we saw that 63% of companies remained committed to addressing pay equity. And that was slightly down from the year prior in 2022, when it was 66%. So we still see like a high level of commitment. Been asked a few times this year, because of the economic situation, will people be less inclined to address pay equity? I just say no, because we are seeing an increasing number of equal pay cases and litigation coming this year, probably because of the whole environment of pay transparency. And, if you're a company that's going through a difficult time financially, the last thing you want to do is kind of get hit by an equal pay claim, because the cost is probably going to be more than it would do to fix the inequity in your company in the first place. So here's the big question, ladies. Do we think the gender pay gap will stay the same, get larger, shrink in 2024? What's your views? Vicky, do you want to start us off?
Not hugely optimistic. I think if we talk about there's obviously, we should talk about the separately controlled and uncontrolled. From a controlled gap, I'm a little bit more optimistic. And that's because of two things. One is that we've got a lot of companies who've been now working this for a little while, right? As you say, we've got the majority of companies are doing something about it, know they want to do something about it. And that's now been growing. And so as more and more companies do it, then more and more companies do it, but also with the pay transparency laws coming in, you have to get your house in order to be able to post those ranges. And so you have to understand what's happening within your organization in order to do that, so that you don't basically advertise a range that your employees are going to be upset about. And so, I do think at the controlled level, so that you're talking about the same jobs, they're going to have to fix that. And so then that becomes that's the control gap, is at the job level, are people being paid the same? And so I do think there's a commitment to that, and the laws and the legislations that are coming in, that we should get that. It's hard though, from a company point of view, I think you can do it. From a country point of view, if we're looking at our gender pay gap report, whether that will change from 99 cents to one, that's a lot harder to get to that last bit.
Right. Okay. So Liz, what about the uncontrolled pay gap or the opportunity gap? Do you think we'll see a change in that in 2024?
Well, I was just feeling more optimistic based on what Vicky said about the controlled pay gap. But when you bring up the opportunity gap or uncontrolled pay gap, I don't have a lot of optimism there. I think there's so much going on in the world right now that this is not bumping up as the top priority. We have a huge election, as you know, in the US next year, and a lot of different legislation, frankly, around women that don't lead me to believe that it's going to be a top priority. That said, I try to be an eternal optimist. I would love to be wrong. And I do think, as you said, Vicky, pay transparency laws, I think women, honestly, we're speaking up more about some of these things, being more educated in the wider range. So that brings me some hope about it. But what about you, Ruth? What are you?
Well, normally when we try to look at it, we're looking at any key demographic changes potentially that might be happening like we saw happen during COVID. And that can sometimes have an impact on whether the gaps are going to close. I can't really see anything that's going to have a significant impact. There's nothing really that I can see is going to happen that's going to significantly change it. And like you, I do have some concern around how the topic of pay equity is becoming politicized. And, with a lot of campaigning, I just read something earlier this morning from The Economist saying that 70 countries are going to vote next year. And that's almost half the world's population are going to be, voting for new governments next year, which is like incredible. So there's going to be a lot of campaigning going on there. And, my concern is whether these issues, just become a little bit politicized. Yeah. What about you, Vicky?
So I've been trying to think about this from a UK point of view as to whether or not the UK one may change, obviously from because it's the equal pay day. And we have seen like a huge increase in salaries here in the UK. And a lot of that has been lower wage people. So there's been some big strike actions, a lot of union actions. So we've had, and for the first time this quarter, I think it is, that pay is actually more than inflation. So even though pay has been rising, inflation has been rising more. So real-time pay has been, not rising. But whereas we're just coming out of that. But we've also had an increase in living wage, increase in the national living wage, which is the minimum wage here. And so because a lot of the lower paid workers are women, like, I'm wondering whether that will actually affect it, because if we bring up the lower end, and because of maybe if we don't increase because obviously there's also the recession issues coming up both in the UK and the US, like a lot of worry about that. So maybe if we're kind of slightly squeezing pay, it might make a difference. I will say that will be a slight might, but also the numbers we're looking at were the full-time. So the Fawcett Society uses the full-time percentages, full-time pay gap. And obviously a lot of those lower paid workers are part-time. So, and if you look at the whole pay gap as a whole, that's 13.2% this year. So like it's higher. So it might affect that more than it'll affect the.
Right.
What do you think about, so I think, I'm don't quote me on this, but I think 1 in 4 women left the workforce during the pandemic, or because, caretaking. And I should have looked at this before we chatted, but I mean, that has an impact as well, right? If there's more women leaving the workforce, I don't know if more are coming back now.
So that's really interesting, because during the pandemic, the pay gap decreased to its lowest amount. And that's because women left. So the lower end fell out, and then suddenly, I mean, it's ridiculous, right? Because it was like, yay, it's great. Oh, hold on, that's because women aren't working anymore. And actually, here in the UK and in the US, inactivity has been decreasing. So they call it inactivity. It's not inactivity, obviously, it's childcare. But it's
the opposite of inactivity.
Oh, yeah, but like that's what it's known as, because it's not employment. And it has been decreasing recently, and I think some of the reasons for that are the fact that costs of living have gone up, and and also some childcare has come back. In the UK, though, childcare is there's a lot of issues in childcare, and in the US, and so it's not as many women have come back as left, I think. But it is definitely it's definitely getting better again.
Yeah, definitely the cost of living crisis having an impact. And, there was that whole kind of, along with all the very great resignation, great everything, it was the great retirement. And we lost kind of a segment of the workforce just after COVID, where they were kind of like, I've really just had enough. We've seen a number of those come back to the workplace. As a result of the cost of living, maybe, they're now suddenly working out that their pension wasn't going to last them as long as they potentially thought it was, with all the kind of squeeze that we've had really on kind of our day-to-day expenses. So, yeah. So we talked about the gender pay gap, but are race and ethnicity a factor in the gender pay gap, Liz? I think that's something we do look at in our GPG report, isn't it?
Yes, we do. So we look at intersectionality. So if that's the intersection of various social categories of race, class, gender, and we apply those to the gender pay gap as well. So these kind of intersections create this interconnectedness between what we ask in our report, we look at if women of different races are impacted differently by the gender pay gap. And we look at, so if women of color are affected, and indeed they are. When the data is uncontrolled, American Indian and Native Alaskan women have the widest pay gap. So 73 cents for every dollar that a white male makes. And then that gets even worse when we were talking a little bit about the executive level there. Hispanic and Black women are making 65 cents to every dollar that their executive peers are making. Whereas white women are making at the executive level 71 cents for every dollar that a male. So, and that sort of like you were earlier saying, Vicky, that in lower paying jobs, maybe that's again like a class situation. People, that's another case of intersectionality. So, short answer, Ruth, yes, it has an impact.
Now, in the UK, Vicky, we have a mandatory gender pay gap reporting scheme that's been around since 2017, where organisations have to publish their gender pay gap. And unfortunately, we haven't seen any significant movement in that in the 6 years of reporting that we've had.
Yeah.
But what about ethnicity reporting? Why don't we have ethnicity, or we don't have ethnicity reporting? Is it coming? And we've heard a lot about the new EU Pay Transparency Directive that's got a whole host of requirements. Is that going to allow us to push reporting through on race and ethnicity?
Yeah, so the UK gender pay gap reporting is on the uncontrolled pay gap for the companies. You don't have to report on a controlled level. And there's no requirement to do anything about it, which I think is probably where the issue is lie. So they just have to say the numbers and then move on. We are one of the countries that is due to have an election next year, and the Labour government is at the moment polling higher than the Conservative government, and they have put forward a proposal that does include mandatory reporting of ethnicity pay gaps and disability pay gaps as well, I believe. And now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen, but I think it's more likely to. In the UK at the moment, we have a voluntary scheme. So if you want to do it, you can, which means that most companies don't. And so I think it's coming for that. I think we will end up building that up in the UK. The ONS does do some stats around it as well, but I don't know whether they do intersectionality. I think maybe they just do them individually. So, and I think this as well won't maybe touch on intersectionality, which of course is the major kind of point of all this. Is it's not about, your one group or your other group. You're actually, there's lots and lots of different groups. And as Liz was talking about, actually, that it's the occupational segregation that we often see that causes some of that. So people in certain groups are paid less, and those groups are where certain demographic or pay people in certain locations, so actually it's really complicated picture. And if we don't use that intersectionality, we kind of miss that really important picture. From the EU point of view, it's not in there. As far as I can tell, it's just gender pay gap. And I think that is because in the EU as a whole, there's not like an agreed scheme on like how to report on ethnicity. And so each country has like different categorizations, different groups of people that are in different, because obviously, there's different ethnicities across Europe. So it's not easy to do, whereas male and female is slightly easier to do. And so I think that's probably why there's also some legislation about like not being able to ask due to issues, obviously, wars,
cultural issues. Yeah.
And so like, I think it's harder, but I don't think it's going to go away. I think it's definitely going to be, a requirement in the long run. It's just harder to do.
Yeah, because it's interesting. I remember having a look at some of the schemas for some of the European countries, and they are, they cover everything from race, ethnicity, but also kind of like immigration status, religion. So, they have quite complex, based on the cultural, political, socioeconomic histories. So many different countries, like 28 member states or whatever. But
if you look at France, protected categories in France, like there's like twice as many as there are in the UK, or so many. And I think that's the problem. Is like, how do you then kind of wrestle that across the whole of the EU?
Right. Okay. So none of us dreadfully optimistic about significant change in gender pay gaps for the year. Sorry, folks, if you were joining for good news today.
Unicorns and rainbows
maybe
are
this
not here.
Maybe this should be our New Year's resolution, to be optimistic about gender pay gap.
So if you could recommend one thing to close us out with that you would recommend any listeners here to do in their organisation that could potentially help to close the gender pay gap in 2024, what would that be? I'm going to start with you first, Vicky.
So I've been doing quite a lot of work on how companies can sort of work out what their comparable workers are. And I am a very big proponent of job architecture. And I know this is something that companies did kind of years ago, and I think it's really important and it's coming back now. And that's because it's not just about job titles. It's actually about understanding where your jobs are and where they fit with each other in the hierarchy of your organization and across the organization, as well as up and down. And if you work on your job architecture as a company and you know where your jobs are, then you can understand whether people within those jobs are being paid fairly, and then across the whole level and it means that the calculations are really easy to do because everything's actually organized. And it also helps with pay transparency because it means you can quite easily understand, if I'm going to post a range, who does that impact? And particularly in the UK and the EU, because equal value is more important. But in the US, the law is about comparable work. It's not just about job titles. And so, although it's potentially a big project, I would say sort yourselves out with a really great job architecture.
That happens to be one of your favourite topics as well.
It is my favourite topic. Apologies to everyone who knows me.
You're playing that party game.
That from me before.
Yeah, what's that party game? You have to stand up and talk about something for 2 minutes. That would be one of your choices, I think, Vicky.
Yep. Yep. I am fully in with job architecture. Yeah.
Okay, Liz, what about you? What would be your one thing you would recommend to our listeners to do in their organisation to close the gender pay gap in 24?
Kind of ties into what the queen of job architecture was just saying. That's my new title for you.
I'm happy with that. I'll take it.
Okay. So ties in with sort of job requirements. So I've seen Walmart, for example, recently said that they are going to be removing some college or degree requirements from jobs across their organization. So not just sort of frontline, but also even in corporate jobs, which I think is a little renegade, it's wonderful. So that really kind of starts to level where all learning counts. I have a background in training, so of course I'm all for the learning that people, their tenure in a job, their skills they've learned on the job, these things can start to matter more or just as much as a degree, and that, you don't need a degree for everything. So I think there's some states as well that have implemented this for their sort of state job. Do I think that's going to fix everything? No, of course not. But it's a one step forward to just look at those requirements and ask yourselves, and that kind of goes to the opportunity gap, right? Maybe not everybody's had the opportunity to go to college, and they shouldn't kind of be punished for that for the rest of their lives.
And you are right. It's kind of, there are so many things that you can do, so many little things and big things that you can do within your organization. For me, I always take it right back to basics. It's just like, measure your pay gaps. If you're not measuring your pay gaps, then you don't know what the problem is and you don't know what you can fix. And I know we've been afraid of measuring pay gaps for quite a long time because of all the legal ramifications. But, that time is really past. Not that the legal risk has gone away, but in the sense that your employees, your investors, your customers, your suppliers all have an interest in whether you are paying people fairly within your organization. And so, now is the time to really measure those gaps. So that would be my recommendation. Well, thank you very much, Liz. And thank you very much, Vicky, for joining me today to talk about gender pay gaps. That's what we think. What do you think? Email us at coffee@payscale.com. And you'll find in the episode the links to the resources that we've talked about today. And if you have any suggestions for future topics you'd like us to talk about, email us there as well. Thank you very much.